when I first met you, when I was an unknown actor. You were an unknown journalist. And we were all both sitting around wondering
where we were
what
going.
was going to happen, what was going to happen to us.
At 96, Clint Eastwood has left behind far more than dozens of films, major awards, and the cold-eyed cowboy persona that became an icon of American cinema. He has also left behind a family of at least 8 children by 6 different women. Some grew up close to him. Some spent years with their father, almost entirely absent from their lives. And one child was not even known to the public until she was already an adult. Eastwood married only twice, yet his romantic life stretched across overlapping relationships, bitter separations, lawsuits, and secrets buried for decades. The simplest explanation is that fame, power, and the magnetism of a Hollywood star allowed him to live entirely on his own terms. But the story may have begun long before Eastwood became famous on a day in 1951 when he nearly vanished into the Pacific Ocean before leaving any trace that he had ever existed. Could the man celebrated for showing no fear of death have spent his entire life fighting a different fear, dying without leaving anything behind to carry him forward? To date, Clint Eastwood is confirmed to have 8 children with 6 different women. That number alone is enough to command attention. But what makes the story complicated is not simply how many children there are. It is the way those separate branches of the family emerged endured, and in some cases remained hidden from public view for years. Some of the children grew up close to Eastwood, became known early, and held at least some place in his public life. Others lived far from the center of his fame. They were rarely seen beside their father, and for a long time were almost entirely absent whenever the public spoke about Clint Eastwood's family. The most startling case is Laurie Murray. Laurie is believed to be Eastwood's first daughter. She was born when he was still very young before he became a Hollywood icon. Soon after her birth, Laurie was reportedly placed for adoption. For years, she grew up with no place in the public portrait of the Eastwood family. Only after reaching adulthood did Laurie reunite with her biological father. Her appearance forced the public to reconsider the entire story. Eastwood's family was not complicated only because of the relationships the press already knew about. It also contained gaps that lasted for decades, chapters revealed only after the people involved had already lived through most of their lives. Another branch of the family that remained concealed for years grew out of Eastwood's relationship with Jacelyn Reeves. Jacelyn was a flight attendant. During their relationship, she and Eastwood had 2 children together, Scott Eastwood and Kathryn Eastwood. But that relationship did not immediately become public knowledge. Jacelyn and the 2 children remained out of sight for years, as though another family were living behind the image Hollywood had been allowed to see. Scott Eastwood later entered acting. Over time, he became Clint Eastwood's most famous child, and was also regarded as one of the children closest to him. On the rare occasions when Scott discussed his family, he described his father as strict, sparing with words, and reluctant to show emotion. It sounded much like the Clint Eastwood the public already knew. Yet behind that hard exterior was a father-son relationship formed under circumstances that were anything but ordinary. Kathryn Eastwood also carries the famous name, though she has appeared far less often in public. As the years passed, Eastwood's other children gradually began appearing together at family events. Group photographs started to reveal a different image, a sprawling family extending across decades and across multiple relationships. Some pursued acting, some moved into music, others chose to work behind the camera. Whatever path they followed, they still carried the Eastwood name, a name with unusual weight in the American entertainment industry. Seen from the present, it can look like continuity. Clint Eastwood has grown old, but his name continues through the generations that followed him. Yet behind that family portrait lies a series of questions with no easy answers. Not every child grew up with a father fully present. Not every relationship ended peacefully. And not every woman who passed through Eastwood's life walked away without being wounded. Years of absence do not disappear because of a reunion photograph. Secrets do not become harmless simply because they are eventually exposed. The more details that emerge, the more contradictory the image of Clint Eastwood becomes. On one side stands the father of a large family with children who continued into the entertainment industry and moments when they appeared together like a united clan. On the other stands a man repeatedly criticized for infidelity, overlapping relationships, and the fact that some of his children were once almost entirely missing from the public story of his life. If 8 children were merely the result of a reckless lifestyle, why did the pattern continue through nearly his entire adult life? And why did Eastwood keep building new relationships even after he had already reached the summit of fame? In 1953, Clint Eastwood married Maggie Johnson, a model and auto industry employee. At the time, Eastwood was not yet a star. He had only begun searching for a foothold in the film industry, taking minor roles with no guarantee that his career would lead anywhere. His marriage to Maggie Johnson lasted more than 3 decades. Measured only by time, it might appear to have been one of Hollywood's more durable marriages. But the length of a marriage does not always reveal the stability or instability inside it. During those same years, Eastwood was repeatedly involved in relationships outside the marriage. As his career expanded, so did the opportunities and relationships surrounding him. Eastwood went from an unknown actor to a face recognized around the world. He moved through film sets, major events, and an industry where the boundary between professional life and private desire was constantly being erased. One of the most widely discussed relationships was with Sondra Locke. Sondra Locke was an Academy Award-nominated actress. She was connected to Eastwood not only in private life, but also through numerous films in which they appeared together. For years, they became a familiar couple, both on screen and behind the camera. Locke was present during a crucial period in Eastwood's career when he was no longer merely an actor, but a filmmaker gaining increasing control over his own projects. But the relationship did not end quietly. When they separated, the conflict moved beyond the private sphere. Prolonged lawsuits shook Hollywood and exposed disputes that had long remained hidden behind the image of a famous couple. What had once occurred in silence now appeared in legal records, accusations, and stories followed closely by the press. Sondra Locke was no longer remembered only as the woman once seen beside Eastwood. She became part of a larger controversy over power control and the way a highly influential man in the film industry treated those closest to him. While the relationship with Locke was widely known, another part of Eastwood's life unfolded in far greater secrecy. That was the family he formed with Jacelyn Reeves. Eastwood and Jacelyn had 2 children, Scott and Kathryn. But for years, neither the relationship nor the existence of the children occupied the center of the public story surrounding him. 2 worlds seemed to exist at the same time. On one side was the Hollywood Clint Eastwood, a man in a long marriage with a rapidly rising career, appearing beside famous actresses. On the other was a family living quietly beyond the spotlight with 2 children whose existence became clear to the public only years later. Eastwood's romantic life continued to expand through other relationships. He had more children. He married a second time and later divorced again. With only 2 official marriages, Eastwood still created multiple branches of family life that overlapped in time. That is what makes his private history so difficult to narrate. There is no clean line leading from one marriage to the next. Instead, there are intersecting relationships, multiple women and children arriving at different points along the same crowded timeline. In his films, Eastwood often told stories that were simple, direct, and stripped of excess. His private life, however, resembled a film with too many storylines unfolding at once. Each had its own characters, its own secrets and consequences that refused to be neatly resolved. Clint Eastwood therefore became known not only as a cinematic legend, but also as one of the stars with the most complicated and mysterious private lives in Hollywood. fame, power, and attraction undoubtedly made it possible for him to live according to his own choices. Eastwood possessed what most men never do. He had celebrity wealth, professional authority, and a magnetic appeal tied to a masculine image constructed over decades. In an environment like Hollywood, those advantages can blur every limit. Famous people are often surrounded by opportunity admiration and a system willing to overlook behavior that would carry immediate consequences for an ordinary person. But even that does not fully explain why Eastwood continued seeking new relationships and fathering more children across so many decades. This was not a brief episode of youthful excess. The pattern continued after he had become a major star, after he had money, success, and a position that was almost impossible to challenge. To search for another explanation, the story must leave Hollywood and return to the cold waters of 1951. In 1951, Clint Eastwood was 21 years old and serving in the military. No one saw him as a future star. Eastwood was simply a tall, quiet young man fulfilling his service and still uncertain where his life would lead. During one trip, he became a passenger aboard a military aircraft flying from Seattle to California. At first, the journey seemed no different from any other flight. But once the aircraft was in the air, systems began to fail. Communications malfunctioned. Navigation equipment also stopped working properly. The crew lost the ability to determine their exact position while the fuel supply continued to fall. With every passing minute, their options narrowed. The aircraft could not remain airborne forever. But below them, there was no runway, only a vast, freezing, dangerous stretch of ocean near Point Reyes. In the end, the plane was forced down into the Pacific. The impact could have ended everything instantly, but Eastwood and the pilot survived. Escaping the aircraft, however, did not mean they were safe. The shore was still far away. The water around them was cold. The aircraft could sink at any moment. There was no camera crew, no stunt double. No one outside the frame to signal that the dangerous scene was over. Eastwood used a life raft. Then he had to swim roughly 2 miles to reach shore. On land, that distance may not sound extraordinary. In the Pacific, in freezing water after the body has just endured a crash, every yard becomes a fight. Body heat drains away. Strength begins to fail. The coastline may remain visible, yet refuse to come closer as quickly as the mind demands. In that moment, the life-saving skills Eastwood had learned during what once seemed like a series of temporary jobs suddenly became decisive. He knew how to remain calm. He knew he had to keep moving. He understood that panic would burn through his strength faster than the cold water itself. Eventually, Eastwood reached the shore. He survived at 21 years before becoming famous for playing men who appeared unafraid of death. But death had come very close. Eastwood was not yet a Hollywood star. He had built no career, started no family, and left no meaningful mark on the world. Had he died that day, almost no one beyond his relatives would have known he had ever existed. There would have been no westerns, no Harry Callahan, no films directed by Eastwood, no awards, no 8 children carrying the Eastwood name into another generation. A life could have ended before its story had truly begun. Years later, Eastwood acknowledged that surviving the event seemed to have changed him. He rarely recounted it with open emotion. Eastwood has always been guarded. He almost never turned private experience into public confession. But a person does not have to speak often about the event that transformed him. Silence does not mean the event has disappeared. It may remain embedded in later decisions, in the way a person measures time, and in the need to accomplish something before that time runs out. But to understand the man who emerged from the Pacific, we have to look back at the years that forged his instinct to save himself. Clint Eastwood was born in 1930 in San Francisco in the midst of the Great Depression. It was a period of profound instability in America. Jobs were scarce, families lived with uncertainty, and leaving a familiar place in search of opportunity was not unusual. Eastwood's family endured those years as well. Because of his father's work, they moved repeatedly before eventually settling in Piedmont, California. For a child, every move means more than a change of address. It means leaving familiar faces, entering another school, and beginning again from nothing. Eastwood learned early what it felt like not to belong completely anywhere. He was not an exceptional student. Eastwood struggled in school, resisted the structure of the classroom, and was transferred from one school to another. Nothing in those years announced a glorious future. There was no clear sign that the quiet boy with an undistinguished academic record would become one of the most influential figures in the history of American cinema. Before entering Hollywood, Eastwood worked a series of different jobs. He was a lifeguard, a laborer, a store employee, and a forest firefighter. These were not glamorous occupations. They brought no fame and placed Eastwood nowhere near the spotlight. But they taught him a simple principle. In many situations, a person is responsible for his own safety and survival. A lifeguard cannot panic when someone else is in danger. A forest firefighter cannot wait for conditions to become convenient. A laborer has to keep working even when no one is watching. Those experiences gradually shaped an Eastwood who was independent, emotionally restrained, and convinced that a person must ultimately rescue himself. That character later became part of his screen image. The men Eastwood played rarely trusted institutions, rules, or other people completely. They inhabited worlds where the system could fail without warning. So, they relied on themselves. But before it became a cinematic persona, it was already Eastwood's way of seeing life. When the plane crashed into the ocean in 1951, he could not simply wait for someone to appear. He had to use what he had learned, control his fear, and find his own way to shore. That instinct kept him alive. But a near-death experience may have driven that self-reliance even further. Once a person understands that life can end without warning, controlling the present may no longer feel sufficient. He may begin trying to control what will remain after he is gone. For Eastwood, that impulse may have taken many forms. Control the career, control the films, create the work, build the name, and perhaps create a family large enough that his presence would not end with his body. 2 years after the crash, Eastwood entered an industry in which he initially controlled almost nothing. In 1953, after leaving the military, Clint Eastwood entered the film industry through a series of small roles. At first, he was not regarded as a remarkable talent. Eastwood was repeatedly criticized for lacking skill. His slow delivery, restrained face, and rigid manner led some in the industry to question whether he could act at all. The qualities that later became his signature were initially treated as defects. Eastwood took minor parts, sometimes leaving almost no impression. He was working inside an industry capable of discarding an actor as quickly as it manufactured a star. Nothing guaranteed that he would last. The first turning point came when Eastwood was cast in the television series Rawhide. The role brought him to a larger audience and gave him his first stable position in the industry. But the real transformation came only when Eastwood appeared in Sergio Leone's westerns. In those films, his silence was no longer a limitation. It became power. The cold stare, the controlled expression, and the way Eastwood could stand motionless in the face of danger created an entirely different kind of character. He was not the polished hero audiences were accustomed to seeing. His figure was solitary, mysterious, and governed by a private code. Eastwood rapidly became a global icon. Later, the character of Police Inspector Harry Callahan further cemented his place in American cinema. Eastwood was no longer standing outside Hollywood's gates. He had become one of the faces that represented the institution itself. But being a famous actor was still not enough. Eastwood founded his own company, moved into directing, and gradually secured almost total control over his films. He did not want his professional fate to depend entirely on the decisions of other people. Eastwood wanted to choose the story, choose how it would be told, and decide when a scene had achieved what it needed. He became known for working quickly. Eastwood rarely shot a scene over and over, and he despised wasting time. On set, he eliminated chaos through discipline. Once a scene contained the necessary emotion, Eastwood usually refused to repeat it, merely in pursuit of artificial perfection. He trusted natural moments and what performers could do when they were not forced to reproduce the same emotion too many times. Across his career, Eastwood gained increasing control over the role, the crew, the schedule, and the way the story itself was framed. He went from a man dismissed as lacking talent to someone capable of deciding almost everything behind the camera. On screen, Eastwood's characters were often solitary men. They survived violence, faced loss, and stared directly at death without complaint. Those characters were not necessarily Eastwood himself, but they reflected crucial elements of his life. A childhood spent constantly moving, an instinct to rely on no one, an escape from death in the Pacific, and an increasingly powerful need to control his own fate. Yet in his private life, that order seemed to vanish. The more successful his career became, the more complicated Eastwood's relationships grew. Women repeatedly entered the story. Families existed in parallel. Children were born under radically different circumstances. On a film set, Eastwood could order a scene to begin and decide when it was over. In life, he could not so easily close the consequences created by his own choices. Hollywood, therefore, began to see two Clint Eastwoods. One controlled almost everything behind the camera. The other created a chain of parallel lives beyond the screen. And that contradiction leads to the central question: did every film, every relationship, and every child grow from the same need to leave a permanent mark? Scott Eastwood has said on several occasions that his father rarely spoke about his private life. Clint Eastwood has also said very little about the 1951 plane crash. That silence has led many to wonder whether the near-death experience shaped everything that followed. Eastwood has never clearly confessed that all his later choices grew out of the accident. He has never publicly said that fathering many children or repeatedly forming new relationships was a response to the moment when he nearly died. And a life stretching across almost a century cannot be explained entirely by a single event. But when the pieces are placed beside one another, a pattern begins to emerge. When the aircraft sank into the Pacific, Eastwood had no career, no family, and no legacy. He was merely a 21-year-old man with no film bearing his name and nothing large enough to make the world remember him. Had he died that day, the story of Clint Eastwood might have ended before it began. The experience may have planted a private and enduring fear, not necessarily the fear of death. Eastwood had faced death and survived. The more frightening possibility may have been that a person could disappear without leaving anything behind to continue in his place. After the accident, Eastwood threw himself into work. He entered the film industry, overcame the early judgments against him, built a name, and became one of the greatest stars in Hollywood. But Eastwood did not stop with acting. He formed his own company, became a director, and created dozens of films. Every film was a trace. Every character continued to exist after production ended. Every audience member who watched an Eastwood film again extended his name further through time. At the same time, his family kept expanding through multiple relationships and multiple children. Some of those children entered acting. Some pursued music. Others worked behind the camera. Whatever path they chose, they still carried the Eastwood name. In both his career and his private life, he seemed to be creating things capable of surviving him. But that interpretation does not excuse betrayal, secrecy, or the pain produced by his relationships. A fear, no matter how deeply buried, does not erase responsibility. The women who shared parts of Eastwood's life still bore the consequences of his decisions. The separations still occurred, The lawsuits remain part of the record. Some of his children still spent years without their father fully present. Understanding a man does not mean forgiving everything he has done. Eastwood's legacy, therefore, consists of more than films, awards, and influence over generations of directors. It also contains breakups, litigation secrecy, and the people wounded by his choices. At 96, Clint Eastwood has entered old age carrying a legacy almost without equal. He has outlived many members of his generation. He has created works watched and rewatched across decades. He has built a name almost impossible to separate from the history of American cinema. His large family has also gradually appeared together. The photographs suggest continuity. Clint Eastwood grows older, but his name remains visible through his children and through the separate paths they have chosen. Still, no one can know with certainty that the 1951 crash explains the whole of Clint Eastwood. Perhaps it was only one episode in an extraordinarily turbulent life. Perhaps his relationships were simply the product of fame power and an environment that allowed celebrities to cross boundaries with few immediate consequences. But within the narrative world of this story, the crash becomes the opening shot in a race that lasted a lifetime. A race to create films, to create a family, to create marks so deep that time could not easily erase them. Perhaps the man who appeared unafraid of death on screen spent his life ensuring that death could never erase his presence completely. A person can survive death, but the fear born in a near-death moment can sometimes go on silently to govern the rest of a life.